Hello, class. Welcome to this lecture on James chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 on patronage and the empire of God. This lecture is a brief overview of this section as a whole. We will have two more lectures on chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, and another one on 8 through 13 because while this is a whole section, there's two distinct parts of it. And, there's picture here is kind of a picture of a party boss handing down things to his minions. And that really does capture James 2, 1 through 13, if not the whole thing, at least verses 1 through 7. Because the first section, verses 1 through 7, and then verses 8 through 13, the first part deals with this idea of patronage, this big patron at the top doling out money and stuff and goods for his clients. And this picture really does a good job of it. James refutes that, actually, and uses the concept of the kingdom of God, actually, and I'm translating it as empire. We can play with that translation a little bit. And what he does is turns this thing upside down. It's pretty intense here, and anybody in the Greco-Roman world would immediately recognize how subversive this passage is. So verses 2 through 7 deal with partiality or favoritism. And that was part and parcel of the patronage system in the Greco-Roman world. We'll talk, if you don't know what patronage is right now, that's totally fine. We'll define that better as we move along. But this is a problem for James, and he critiques that problem, shows how ridiculous it is, and then in 8 through 13, he gives the solution, and the solution is this law of the empire of God. And that's a lot to take in because law, empire, and God are kind of loaded terms. But his solution to alleviate the problem of the patronage system is with this royal law or this imperial law or this godly, divine imperial law that turns everything on its head. So let's look at this judging patronage. Patronage was the basis of the entire Roman society and economy. It was the socio-economic system or the patron-client system of the Greco-Roman world. It was how the whole empire was held together economically and socially because money passes through hands, and the hands that it passes through are people, and that money kind of dictates how those people relate to each other. It dictates the relationship between people. Now listen, this is not just a Greco-Roman concept here. We still have systems of economics and social systems that really do kind of define the way our society relates to each other. Individuals relate in this society. So it begs the question, I think, of how we can understand this passage in our own socioeconomic system in America and maybe in the world. But that is for the third lecture. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. So the wealthy patrons, these kind of elite few that ruled everything, they took care of those who were under them. And this is where we get our word patronize. So patronize can be used in two ways, a positive and a negative way. So businesses like patrons, right? They want you to patronize their business. In other words, they want you to come in and spend money, right? A patron of the arts is someone who gives a lot of money to the arts. But you'll also hear people who say, "Don't patronize me," and that's just the opposite. Instead of wanting somebody to give you advice or giving you money, this is kind of a resistance to that. And patronize there is used as a nasty term. And it also can be like when somebody thinks they know everything, and they're going to tell you how to do things or tell you how to operate. That's where you'd be like, well, don't patronize me. Don't belittle me. Don't just throw stuff at me and think that I'm going to do whatever you say. So in the Greco-Roman world, these wealthy patrons took care of those who were under them, and literally it was under them. There was a rigid hierarchy there. But what came with that is that patrons did have a deep sense of responsibility for caring for those who were under them. So it wasn't just to take care of those who were under them. It actually was there to show the honor that these patrons had. So the more they took care of their clients, the more honor that the patron received in society. In other words, they were looked at as kind of benevolent dictators, if you will, or the wealthy people who took it, like Batman, right? Bruce Wayne and Batman. I think that's maybe a good example of a patron is billionaire who is a vigilante and fights crime, right? And so patrons would take care of people, but it would also bring them honor in a public setting. So it wasn't just to take care of others. It was to kind of grow their own honor and prestige among other patrons, right? And so the way they took care of their clients showed everyone how wealthy they were. I mean, if you were really taking care of your clients, that meant you had a lot of wealth, and that gave you a lot more status in the whole Greco-Roman system. So it was self-serving to really take care of your clients as much as it was for kind of this altruistic take care of people because they actually need it. And the clients were those who were taken care of, and this is the large portion of the Greco-Roman world. Clients could actually seek out patrons. So if you needed something, so you would look at who the major patrons were in your city, and then you would try to get an audience with that patron, bring your request to them, work through the family system to bring your case to the patron. And the wealthier the patron was, the more honor the client had. In other words, if the wealthiest patron in the city of Ephesus, if you were that patron's client, then you had status. So the more you could move into the wealthiest patron's patronage, the more honor you had as a client. And the Greco-Roman cities themselves would throw festivals for the emperor. And the emperor was absolutely understood as the greatest patron of all, the most powerful patron in the empire. And these cities would throw festivals for the Caesar, the emperor, in order to woo the emperor to patronize their city and lobby for a patron. So they literally would go all out and throw this big parade for the emperor so that he would patronize them and give them money. And but you showed the patron how much you loved them and esteemed them and gave them glory by how much you kind of spent on these festivals. So it was a two-way street. Clients could seek out patrons, and patrons could patronize whoever they wanted. But there weren't a ton of patrons. I mean, this was a small ruling class, mostly senators or equestrians. These are the top two classes in the Roman world. And the senators were literally senators in the Roman government. And these senators had large pieces of land. Most of them were generals in the army. And when they conquered places, they just divided that land up among themselves. And so these senators had large areas that they owned, large pieces of land that was theirs. And the equestrians were the same thing. Equestrians weren't senators, but the equestrians were people who had large sections of land. They did a lot of wheat and wine, and so they were very wealthy people, and usually also part of the military as well. So they kind of the system worked out that they took care of everybody under them. They would pay people to be in the fields. The lands that they would conquer, they would enslave those people instead of just killing them all off. And then they would use them to work their fields, which then turned into the grain that made the bread and the pasta of the Roman world, and the beer. They would work. They would make them do the vineyards so they could do wine. They would make them do the oil presses for olive oil. So some of the basic things in their culture is these equestrians and senators were responsible for producing it and feeding the whole Roman world. So that's the socioeconomic system in Rome during the time of Jesus and James. So the man wearing a gold ring in chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, I think, that social setting, says that a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing. So gold rings were very restrictive. You couldn't just buy a gold ring, and you just couldn't wear a gold ring. Gold rings were status symbols, and it would be like impersonating a police officer if you wore a green. You'd be if you wore a gold ring, it'd be like you're impersonating a senator or equestrian class, and that was strictly forbidden in Roman law. So gold rings were status symbols that were specifically held by a senatorial or equestrian class, and these were very wealthy people, and they were certainly patrons. So when James talks about if a man, he uses the word aner, if a man with gold rings, wearing gold rings, or wearing gold, and dressed in fine clothing comes into your synagogue, and he uses the word synagogue, and then a destitute person, a patokos, a destitute person comes in shabby clothing, you basically are supposed to treat him the same way. That's what James says. And this would have been absurd in the Roman world. Roman society necessarily showed wealthy patrons respect and gave them places of honor in social settings. That's how the Roman world worked. And this idea that a patron, an equestrian or senatorial class person, would be at some level, at any level, equal to other human beings who are not of the same status was completely absurd in the Roman world. And the poor, in this case, completely destitute. So in chapter 1, we talked about the humble brother should be exalted in his, should be exalted. Well, that word humble is a different word than this word for poor. This word is completely destitute. This is somebody who will never be able to work to provide for themselves. You know, a widow would be patokos, the poor. An orphan would be considered in this class. So this is somebody completely destitute. And poor people would have absolutely been separated as far as possible from patrons. You couldn't even be a client of a patron if you were this kind of destitution. So you couldn't even approach the patrons if you were in this kind of situation. So the setting here is a synagogue, which indicate the word itself. It indicates how early this letter may have been. So early on in the Jesus movement, they talked about an ecclesia, which meant assembly, a gathering place. So the word ecclesia is used in James, but here it's specifically synagogon, a synagogue. And that is, synagogues were certainly Jewish, Judean places where they would meet for religious worship. So here, this is a worship setting in a Jewish worship setting, and it indicates that it's early, right? We'll talk more about it later. And James utterly condemns, and this is just, I can't tell you how radical this actually is. James utterly condemns the entire socioeconomic system of patronage by turning it upside down. And this would be absolutely seditious. It would be equal to sedition. Basically, you're saying the whole Roman world is wrong. And the Romans felt like they had the right to run the world this way because they had found favor with the gods. The gods were the ones who were appeased, and the gods had given them all this land, and the gods had given them victory over all these people. And so the gods had ordained that Rome be this way. So when James says that it's completely wrong and the equestrians and senators absolutely don't require any more respect than the most destitute in society, that would be utterly seditious. And so this is overtly subversive and resistant to Roman cultural ethic. And it's part and parcel of the way James understood the Jesus movement. The Jesus movement, then, from the very earliest part of it, from James, one of the earliest letters written in the New Testament, shows that the Jesus movement was counter to Roman socioeconomic systems. There's just no getting around that when you read the letter this way. So, continuing on, whether the situation, so the question is this senator or equestrian person coming into the synagogue at the same time as somebody who's completely destitute, is this a real situation that's happening in the early Jesus movement and James is critiquing it? Or is this a hypothetical, like if this happens? Now, the word if is used, but it can also be translated when this happens, do this, instead of if this happens, do this. But it kind of begs the question, is it real or is it hypothetical? And it shows James's, but either way, whether it's real or hypothetical, it shows James's disdain for the patronage system. If a real senator or equestrian class person walked into a synagogue, that would be pretty radical in and of itself. But if somebody of the high class came into a situation like this, they would absolutely assume that they would be given a higher position. So, real or hypothetical, James is critiquing the patronage system, and he argues, in fact, that the destitute, the poor, have a privileged space with God, a God who prefers the poor over the rich. James says this, do you not know that God has chosen the poor to be rich in faith? And this goes into what we saw in chapter 1, this kind of divine reversal where the rich will be made humble and the humble will be exalted. That's exactly what James is doing here in more with a little bit longer essay, if you will. So he uses 13 verses here. So that stuff that's happening in the epitome in chapter 1, the kind of the table of contents, this is the section where he fills that out. That the privileged, the rich, the wealthy are at the bottom, and the destitute have a privileged place over them in the realm of God. The question is he just talking about, and this only happens in the synagogue, and when you leave here, that everything goes back to normal? Some people make that argument. There's just nothing about this that he never says that, right? James never says that these rules only apply within the assembly or the synagogue. These rules seem to apply for these guys everywhere. So it's kind of the great equality that early Jesus movement people, James in particular, are espousing that makes it so unpalatable for others. So the rich in verse 7 are those who oppress, They drag to court, and they blaspheme the name of God that's been the good name that's been called over you. So it's hard to see James have a lot of respect for the wealthy. And then later on in that second passage, the second section, verses 8 through 13, he there quotes Leviticus 19:18. He uses the Decalogue, which is the Ten Commandments. Deca is 10, log is word, the 10 words, the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20, from Exodus 20, 13 through 14, and the Ten Commandments also come up in Deuteronomy 5, 17 through 18. So James uses Leviticus 19:18, the Decalogue, and Jesus' tradition, and we'll talk about this later on, to refute patronage. So he goes to Scripture and he goes to the tradition of Jesus to show how the patronage system is utterly bankrupt. So that's pretty intense. So the whole theme of chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 is favoritism and judgment. And favoritism is a judgment. You determine, you make a judgment about who's good in your society, right? And in the Greco-Roman patronage system, those are the wealthy elite people, and you're supposed to favor them. So favoritism is a judgment. But favoritism to the wealthy is a wrong one. That's what James is saying. So James here is utterly critiquing the patronage system of the Greco-Roman world, turning it on its head. That's a brief overview of the whole section 2, 1 through 13. The next sections will deal specifically with verses 1 through 7, and then the next one, verses 8 through 13. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. I look forward to reading those emails and responding to you when they come in. Hope this was a good lecture for you and helps you kind of think about the letter of James in a different way.